Good morning. I'm delighted to join the International Sustainability Transitions Conference of 2021 from Victoria, British Columbia in Canada. I'm here today to talk about my new paper that's being published in Energy Policy and also in the Geography of Innovation and Sustainability Transitions working paper series. The paper is called Reconfiguring Actors and Infrastructure in City Renewable Energy Transitions, a Regional Perspective. And my co-authors are Jessica Conroy and Anna Burka. So I became really interested in energy planning and energy geography. And this paper materialized because I was curious about 100% renewable energy transitions for cities. There were a lot of cities that were making pledges to shift to 100% renewable energy or carbon neutrality. And my background is partly in ecological economics. And so I was simultaneously thinking about the material aspects of this. What does it mean when we go to scale to 100% renewable energy, particularly given the spatial density of renewable energy? And I was thinking about this in terms of context. For example, the city boundary. Could cities be self-sufficient? How would this impact institutions and incumbent actors of that context? And I've been studying decentralized decisions, and a lot of that literature around transitions and decentralized decisions has really emphasized bounded local, urban, and national scales rather than regional scales, interscalar relationships, and place-based analysis when you consider both material and socio-economic perspective. And so when I put together 100% renewable energy transitions context, which is for me energy geography, and then thinking about the decentralization literature, I realized that we needed to dig a little bit deeper, particularly into interscalar relationship and the new geography of socioeconomic outcomes. So a little bit of background on cities. They account for over 2/3 of global carbon emissions and energy demand. So they're really, really large centers of energy demand. Most of our population growth will occur in cities. If we decarbonize transportation, for example, through electric vehicles, most of that will also happen in cities, and that will really increase the load for electricity. Most cities are vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, particularly because they're along coastlines. And interestingly, with all of this demand and all of this population, they only occupy 2% of the world's landmass. So they require large amounts of energy in small spaces, which means that they have a very high spatial energy density of demand. Here's an example of this. This is my hometown of Toronto. And what happened in Toronto, it's the biggest city in Canada, and the population has been growing year on year. And they've been putting more and more condominium towers, very tall high rises in the downtown of Toronto. And the municipality took a look at this and said, well, we don't think that the transmission lines that are coming into the city that you can see in the image are going to be able to supply all of this new demand that's happening in this very spatially dense downtown core. And so what's also happening with cities is that they're already constrained geographically for supply and demand. This is a chart by Vaclav Smil that I really like, and it explains a little bit more about how that geographic supply-demand constraint will play out with renewable energy. So the y-axis is the power density of demand. It's the number of watts that need to be used or is available per meter square of spatial area. So for example, at the very high end, we see thermal electricity generation, which would be nuclear or coal, which are relatively small spatially in terms of the size of their power plants, but they produce quite a bit of energy per square meter. Towards the bottom, we have things like liquid biofuels, rooftop photovoltaic, solar farm photovoltaic, which requires quite a bit more space per watt produced. We also see at the very top high-rise buildings that demand a lot of energy in a small area. And we see lower down, we see, for example, houses that demand less energy per area because they're a lot smaller. On the x-axis, we have the amount of area required. And so at the far right, we have cities. And so cities are relatively, on average, power dense in terms of demand. And on average, they're large, you know, when you think about them in comparison to, say, houses. And so what you can see is that urban areas have high energy density of demand, and the energy density of renewable energy is much lower than that of urban areas, and by orders of magnitude. And this means that there's major land use implications of a renewable energy transition. So in our paper, we argued that there are regional impact dimensions of city renewable energy transition. So first of all, we're going to need new land use for renewable energy production. And we need to be thinking regionally about trade-offs and space constraints in the use of peri-urban land. We also argued that regional infrastructure is really critical in this transition. Infrastructural investments are required to overcome network constraints and build in flexibility mechanisms. We found in our literature search, spatial agglomeration and smart specialization of firms is critical. And so, for example, we might need to think about, or we do need to think about, the regional coordination of development capabilities in specific fields, technologies, subsystems, in order to have these city energy transition plans happen. We also need to think about actor involvement. So, for example, this really, again, affects incumbent actors and new actors. But instead of looking simply at local actors, now we're looking at local actors inside the city, in the region, outside of the city, and how they're interacting. So, for example, are actors inside of cities investing in, say, renewable energy cooperatives outside of cities in order to import that energy into cities? And all of these factors shape the socio-economic outcomes, particularly, you know, the combination of how we have regional land use, infrastructure, agglomeration of firms, and actor involvement. And this affects the distribution of costs and benefits, which influences social acceptance. So we decided to look at this empirically. We found that a lot of cities are pursuing 100% renewable energy and carbon neutrality, and they have their own proposed plans to a renewable energy transition. So we identified quite a few of these plans, 47 of them, and they also met the minimum threshold for population and population density of cities. So this is our sample of plans. In blue, the plans are carbon neutral. In yellow, the plans are 100% renewable energy. And so along the x-axis, we have population, and the y-axis, we have population density. So you can see that most of the plans are within 10,000 persons per square kilometer and less than 2 million people, but it goes all the way up to 14 million, close to 14 million people with Tokyo. And so this is a breakdown of that smaller subset that you saw in the other chart. So quite a few cities around the world, although mostly found in North America and in Europe. So we coded the plans for whether energy was produced inside the city, whether it was produced in a neighboring community or the region, or whether it came from the existing power grid or energy system, and also if the location wasn't specified. We looked at the actors involved. So we looked at whether actors were inside the city's boundaries, for example, residents, local organizations, or the city itself. We looked at whether there were regional actors, such as regional authorities, residents, businesses. And then we also looked at centralized actors. So these are traditionally centralized, such as those operating at subnational, national, international scales that have typically controlled energy systems in various ways. Finally, we looked at 4 different actor types. We looked at civic actors, such as residents and citizens. We looked at whether they were public actors like governments, local authorities. We looked at whether they were private actors, such as firms, financial institutions, and private utilities. We also looked for partnerships, which was some combination of civic, public, and private. So the results show that overall, most of the city's plans mention local energy production, and then followed by LNS means location not specified. So they weren't clear where the production would come from. There was still quite a bit of energy coming from the existing energy system, but proportionally fewer were looking at energy produced in the region, so outside of the city. When we look at what we're calling actor-scalar strategies, what we found was that there was quite a bit of local actor participation in the plans, and most of those were public. So for example, municipalities, followed by civic, followed by private. The next largest part of the sample, though, were centralized actors that were public, then private, and then civic. And the last part of the sample were regional actors. And we found that this broke down because some plans fell really into a more centralized category, like where I live in Victoria. They've pledged to do 100% renewable energy, but they've said, well, we'll do things inside the city, but we're going to rely on BC Hydro, our utility, to get us to 100%. Whereas Paris and several cities in Germany are relying more on regional actors, on regional districts, and working with neighboring communities and municipalities directly in order to enact their plan. In conclusion, what we found was that there were really distinct actor-scalar strategies that were occurring across these plans at the outset of these transitions. And we found that regional actors and spaces and new interscalar relationships are critical to city renewable energy transitions, and that these impact socioeconomic outcomes. Our study revealed the need for more spatial modeling studies of city energy transitions. We found that there were actually very, very few being done. And what we mean by that is that some studies were showing that cities could not be self-sufficient in transitioning to renewable energy, but they sort of left it there. They didn't really look at, well, where will the energy come from and what will be the implications on regions? What we suggest for another study, which we're undertaking, is to study the range of actor-scalar strategies in terms of the institutional settings that are pre-existing, the policy mixes that are pre-existing and being implemented. And then we can start to look at the effectiveness in implementation. So for example, are the plans that are more centralized, are they more or less effective or differently effective than plans that are more regional in scale and more decentralized? And I think that the outcomes of that will be pretty interesting. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation. Please feel free to reach out. You can find me on Twitter. You can look at my website for any other research, and you can also contact me.